$1,000 to anyone who can put me on the ground." The challenge rolled across the training field, followed by laughter, whistles, and the easy confidence that always seems to gather wherever young Marines believe they have already seen everything worth seeing. Marine Corps Heritage Day had transformed Camp Pendleton into a place where families wandered between historic vehicles, recruiting displays, and food tents, while children waved miniature American flags beneath the warm California sky. At the center of the crowd stood Staff Sergeant Tyler Brooks, smiling beside a hand-painted sign promising $1,000 to anyone willing to test themselves against him during a friendly demonstration. Most people expected another entertaining volunteer and another predictable ending. Then an elderly man stepped quietly out of the crowd. He wore faded blue jeans, worn work boots, and an olive jacket so old that its color had nearly blended with time itself. A polished oak cane rested comfortably in one hand, not like a burden, but like something that had traveled beside him for many years. No medals decorated his jacket. No insignia asked for attention. Nathan Mercer never looked at the prize money, and he never looked at the spectators waiting for someone to fail. Instead, his pale blue eyes settled on the younger Marine's feet with calm, deliberate focus. It was such an ordinary glance that almost everyone ignored it. Almost everyone except one retired Marine standing near the back of the crowd, whose smile slowly disappeared as a memory he had not visited in decades quietly stirred to life. Nathan Mercer continued forward with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who had never measured confidence by the speed of his steps. The polished tip of his oak cane met the concrete with a gentle rhythm that disappeared beneath the conversations drifting across the festival grounds. Families gathered beneath white tents to escape the afternoon sun. Older veterans compared faded photographs and stories that had grown shorter with age. Young Marines laughed with one another while waiting for the next volunteer to step onto the demonstration mat. To them, the elderly stranger was simply another visitor looking for a closer view. Nathan stopped several feet from Staff Sergeant Tyler Brooks and quietly surveyed the training area without saying a word. His eyes moved across the painted boundary lines, the slight slope beneath the mat, and the fine layer of dust collecting along one edge, where a light breeze had carried it throughout the afternoon. Most people believed he was searching for a comfortable place to stand. Someone who had spent a lifetime teaching Marines would have recognized something very different. He was reading the ground before he ever looked at the man standing on it. Brooks studied the visitor with polite curiosity. He had spent years teaching confidence, discipline, and controlled movement to younger Marines, and nothing about the elderly man suggested he had come to make a statement. "Sir," Brooks said with an easy smile, "are you thinking about giving it a try?" Nathan lifted his eyes and returned the smile with one of his own, and smaller but somehow more genuine. "I am thinking," he answered, "that every lesson begins before anyone notices it has started." A few spectators laughed, assuming they had heard another harmless remark from an old storyteller. Brooks chuckled as well. "Well, I promise we will keep it friendly." Nathan nodded. "That is usually the best place to begin." The exchange was calm, almost forgettable, yet one man standing near the rear barrier felt an unexpected weight settle across his shoulders. Retired Master Gunnery Sergeant Frank Delaney lowered the paper cup he had been holding and watched Nathan more carefully than everyone else. It was not the cane that caught his attention. It was the way Nathan stood without appearing to favor either leg. It was the relaxed position of his shoulders. It was the quiet habit of keeping his eyes on another Marine's balance instead of his face. Delaney had seen that posture only once before, nearly 50 years earlier, when he was a young corporal struggling through an instructor course at Camp Pendleton. The memory arrived without warning, leaving him with the uncomfortable feeling that he was looking at someone he should recognize, but could not yet name. Around him the festival continued exactly as before, but Delaney no longer heard the laughter or the announcer preparing the next demonstration. He found himself watching the elderly Marine with growing certainty that the afternoon was about to become something nobody there would ever forget. The announcer sensed that the crowd wanted the moment to move forward, so he lifted the microphone with another broad smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, it looks like we have a challenger." A round of applause spread across the training area as dozens of phones rose into the air, ready to capture what everyone assumed would become another amusing memory from the day's events. Staff Sergeant Tyler Brooks stepped closer, keeping his tone friendly but confident. "Sir, before we begin, I want to make sure you understand this is only a demonstration." Nathan Mercer gave a slight nod. "That is exactly why I walked over." Brooks glanced at the polished oak cane. "Will you be all right standing without it?" Nathan looked down at the smooth piece of wood for a moment before meeting the younger Marine's eyes again. "This old thing has followed me for a long time. I would rather not leave an old friend behind." The answer earned another ripple of laughter from the audience. Brooks smiled politely. "Fair enough. I just do not want anyone thinking we are taking advantage of one of our veterans." Nathan's expression remained composed. Respect is not measured by age. It is measured by how people treat each other. The words landed more heavily than Brooks expected. For the first time that afternoon, he paused before answering. "I can agree with that." The announcer, eager to keep the energy high, called out, "Remember, $1,000 if our volunteer can put Staff Sergeant Brooks on the ground." The spectators cheered again, but Nathan never even glanced toward the prize board. Brooks noticed it immediately. Most challengers looked at the money first. Nathan never had. "You really are not interested in the prize, are you?" Brooks asked quietly. Nathan answered without hesitation. "I have lived long enough to learn that money solves fewer problems than people imagine." Brooks laughed softly. "Then why accept the challenge?" Nathan's eyes drifted briefly toward the rows of young Marines watching from behind the rope barrier. "Because sometimes the lesson people remember has nothing to do with the contest they came to watch." Brooks studied the older Marine with growing curiosity. He had expected nervousness, stubborn pride, or an oversized ego hidden beneath quiet words. Instead, he found none of them. Standing across from him was a man who seemed completely comfortable with whatever happened next. Behind the spectators, Frank Delaney felt another forgotten memory pressing against the edges of his mind. The voice, the patience, the habit of answering questions with lessons instead of opinions. He had heard that before. Somewhere on a hot California training field many decades earlier, Delaney narrowed his eyes as Nathan gently shifted the cane from one side to the other, not to support himself, but almost as though preparing for a familiar routine. An uneasy certainty settled over the retired Master Gunnery Sergeant. The elderly Marine standing inside the demonstration circle was not here to win $1,000. He was about to remind everyone watching that the most valuable knowledge is usually carried by the person making the least noise. Staff Sergeant Tyler Brooks took one respectful step forward and raised his hands in a relaxed training stance. He was careful, giving the older Marine every opportunity to change his mind without embarrassment. "Whenever you are ready, sir," he said. Nathan Mercer smiled faintly. "You have better manners than most instructors I knew when I was your age." Brooks laughed. "I will take that as a compliment." Nathan inclined his head. "You should." Then he made the smallest movement anyone on the field had seen all afternoon. He lifted the polished oak cane just high enough to reposition it beside his right boot, before letting its tip settle gently onto the mat. The sound was soft, almost impossible to notice beneath the distant conversations drifting across the festival. Yet Frank Delaney heard it as clearly as a bugle at sunrise. His breathing caught. That simple motion unlocked a memory he had not revisited in almost 5 decades. The demonstration field disappeared, replaced by a dusty training range at Camp Pendleton, where the summer heat shimmered above the packed earth. A lean Marine instructor walked quietly between rows of exhausted recruits, carrying a smooth wooden staff polished by years of steady hands instead of constant use. The instructor never barked orders. He never humiliated struggling Marines. He simply adjusted a shoulder, corrected a stance, or moved a boot a single inch until balance replaced effort. Delaney could still hear the calm voice that had shaped an entire generation of instructors. "Control your footing before you think about controlling another person. Balance wins arguments that strength never can." Young Marines respected that instructor because every lesson made sense long before they understood why. The memory faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Delaney staring at Nathan Mercer with widening eyes. The position of the cane was not meant to support aging knees. It marked distance, it measured space, it quietly invited patience instead of force. Nathan rested one weathered hand across the smooth handle, his posture composed and natural, while Brooks remained unaware that he was looking at a teaching method older than many traditions still practiced on Marine training grounds. Around them, families continued strolling between exhibits. Children laughed near restored military vehicles, and volunteers served cold lemonade beneath white tents. Nothing about the afternoon suggested history had quietly stepped back into the sunlight. Brooks looked toward Nathan again, curiosity replacing confidence. "Is that how you always stand?" Nathan answered with the same measured tone that never seemed hurried. "No, that is how I remind myself not to hurry." Brooks nodded thoughtfully, no longer hearing ordinary answers from an ordinary visitor. Behind the crowd, Frank Delaney slowly removed his Marine Corps cap, holding it against his chest without realizing he had done so. At that moment, he no longer wondered whether he recognized the elderly Marine. He knew exactly who Nathan Mercer was, and with that realization came another thought that settled heavily in his mind. If Nathan Mercer truly was standing on this training field again after all these years, someone much higher in the chain of command deserved to know before the lesson reached its unforgettable ending. Tyler Brooks took a slow breath and offered Nathan Mercer one final opportunity to step away with complete dignity. "Sir, if you would rather simply talk with these young Marines, I would be honored to give you the microphone instead." Nathan smiled warmly and gave a slight shake of his head. Conversation is important. Sometimes a quiet example stays with people even longer. Brooks respected the answer enough not to argue. He settled into a balanced stance, careful and controlled, determined that whatever happened next would reflect well on the Marine Corps. Nathan remained exactly where he was, his polished oak cane resting lightly beneath one hand. There was no tension in his shoulders, no dramatic preparation, and no hint that he intended to surprise anyone. He simply waited. "Whenever you are ready," he said. Brooks nodded and eased forward with the deliberate pace of an experienced instructor. He was not trying to overwhelm the older man. His intention was to demonstrate movement, timing, and safe control for the families gathered around the training area. Yet the instant he committed to his first step, something unexpected happened. Nathan shifted his lead foot no more than a few inches, while the cane remained quietly planted beside him. It was such a small adjustment that most spectators never noticed it. Brooks suddenly found himself reaching toward a position that no longer existed. Without realizing why, he instinctively corrected his own balance and stopped before overextending. The movement was clean, disciplined, and entirely under his control, but it forced him to reset. A puzzled murmur spread through the crowd. They had expected speed or strength. Instead, they had witnessed almost nothing at all. Brooks looked at Nathan with genuine curiosity. "Did you know exactly where I was going?" Nathan answered with the calm patience of a teacher instead of the satisfaction of a winner. "You told me with your feet before the rest of you arrived." Brooks blinked, turning those words over in his mind. He tried again, this time approaching from a slightly different angle. Nathan did not retreat. He did not advance. He merely adjusted his position with effortless precision, allowing Brooks to recognize on his own that every path he considered had already been quietly anticipated. Brooks stopped once more and lowered his hands, not out of frustration, but out of growing respect. "I have never seen anyone teach balance that way," he admitted honestly. Nathan's smile returned. "Because most people try to teach movement first. Balance comes before movement." The spectators fell silent. Even those with no military experience sensed they had just witnessed something far more valuable than a public contest. Behind them, Frank Delaney slipped his weathered phone from his pocket. His hands remained steady, but his heartbeat did not. He had seen enough. There was no longer any doubt in his mind. Nathan Mercer had not come to collect prize money or relive old glory. He had quietly delivered the same lesson that had shaped generations of Marines decades earlier. Delaney scrolled to a number he had promised himself he would never need again, drew one slow breath, and pressed the call button, knowing that someone still serving the Corps deserved to hear one simple sentence before the afternoon moved any further. Frank Delaney stepped away from the spectators until the voices behind him faded into a distant murmur. He looked back once at Nathan Mercer before reaching into the inside pocket of his old field jacket. The flip phone he carried was scratched from years of use, but one number stored inside had never been deleted. It belonged to Colonel Robert Harris, a Marine officer, who had once been one of the last instructors personally mentored by Nathan. Delaney pressed the call button and listened as the line connected almost immediately. "Colonel Harris speaking." Delaney smiled faintly. "Colonel, this is Frank Delaney." The voice on the other end warmed at once. "Master Guns. It has been a long time. What can I do for you?" Delaney glanced toward the demonstration mat where Nathan and Staff Sergeant Tyler Brooks were quietly talking instead of competing. "I believe Nathan Mercer is standing at Heritage Day." The response did not come right away. There was no confusion, no request for clarification, only a long silence filled with recognition. Finally, Harris spoke in a lower voice. "Are you certain?" Delaney answered without hesitation. "I watched him teach 2 lessons without laying a hand on anyone. I would recognize that style anywhere." A chair slid across the floor on the other end of the line. Papers rustled. Then Harris asked one final question. "Does he still carry the oak cane?" Delaney looked at the smooth wooden cane resting beside Nathan's boot. "Yes," Harris quietly exhaled. "Stay with him. I am making another call." The connection ended. Less than a minute later, Colonel Harris stood outside the office of Brigadier General Daniel Whitaker. He did not knock twice. One firm knock was enough before the general invited him inside. Whitaker looked up from a stack of briefing folders. "What is it, Colonel?" Harris remained standing. "Sir, Nathan Mercer is on base." The general slowly removed his reading glasses and studied Harris for several seconds. "You are certain?" "Completely, sir." Whitaker walked to the window overlooking the parade grounds. His father had spoken of Nathan Mercer many times during his own Marine career. Not as a decorated celebrity or a famous commander, but as the quiet instructor who taught Marines how to protect one another before teaching them how to defeat an opponent. The general remembered something his father repeated every Memorial Day. "If you ever meet Nathan Mercer, thank him before you introduce yourself." Whitaker picked up his service cap and buttoned his dress coat. His aide entered with the schedule for the afternoon officer's reception. "Sir, your vehicle is waiting." Whitaker nodded. "Good. We are changing destinations." The aide looked surprised. "Should I notify the event coordinator?" The general answered calmly. "Yes. Tell them I am going to welcome an old Marine who should never have needed an invitation." Back on the demonstration field, Nathan accepted a paper cup of water from a volunteer and thanked her with a warm smile. Tyler Brooks stood beside him, asking thoughtful questions instead of preparing another demonstration. Around them, the festival continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Yet across the installation, an invisible chain of respect had already begun moving quietly from one Marine to another, carried by a single name that time had never managed to erase. The government vehicle moved steadily across Camp Pendleton, passing rows of barracks, maintenance buildings, and training fields where young Marines continued their daily routines, without realizing that an ordinary afternoon had quietly become something worth remembering. Brigadier General Daniel Whitaker sat silently in the rear seat, looking through the window as familiar landmarks slipped by one after another. His aide reviewed the updated schedule before speaking. "Sir, the reception committee has been informed that you will arrive later than planned." Whitaker nodded once. "They can wait." The aide hesitated before asking the question that had been on his mind since leaving headquarters. "Sir, was Nathan Mercer someone you served with?" The general gave a faint smile. "No, I served because men like Nathan Mercer came before me." He rested one hand on the leather folder beside him without opening it. There was no need. The stories had been part of his life since childhood. His father had never described Nathan as the strongest Marine he had known. He always described him as the instructor who quietly prevented young Marines from making mistakes they would only have one chance to make. The best teachers, his father often said, leave fingerprints on people instead of history books. Whitaker had never forgotten those words. Back at the demonstration field, Staff Sergeant Tyler Brooks remained beside Nathan Mercer, no longer treating him as a challenger, but as someone whose experience deserved to be heard. "Sir," Brooks asked thoughtfully, "did you ever imagine people would still remember those lessons after all these years?" Nathan looked across the field where several young Marines were helping children climb into a restored military vehicle. A gentle smile crossed his face. "I never taught Marines so they would remember me. I taught them so they would remember each other." Brooks lowered his eyes for a moment. The answer settled more deeply than he expected. He thought back to the confidence he had carried only an hour earlier and felt an uncomfortable sense of regret. He had judged the elderly visitor before asking a single meaningful question. Looking at Nathan now, he realized how easily respect can be delayed by assumptions. "Sir," Brooks said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I believed I already understood who you were before I ever listened." Nathan turned toward him with kind, patient eyes. "Then today has already been worthwhile. A Marine who is willing to change his mind is a Marine who never stops learning." Brooks felt the weight in his chest ease just enough to breathe freely again. At that same moment, the dark government vehicle turned onto the access road leading toward the demonstration area. Marines assigned to event security noticed it first, and instinctively straightened their posture. Without creating a disturbance, they respectfully cleared a narrow path through the spectators. Families looked around with quiet curiosity. Volunteers lowered their radios. Even the announcer glanced toward the approaching vehicle before deciding not to interrupt the unusual calm that had settled over the crowd. Nathan Mercer remained exactly where he was, one hand resting naturally on the polished oak cane, unaware or perhaps entirely unconcerned that every decision made during the last 15 minutes had quietly led one of the Marine Corps' senior leaders to come looking for a man who had spent a lifetime believing the greatest lessons never needed recognition. The vehicle came to a smooth stop at the edge of the demonstration field without flashing lights or unnecessary ceremony. Its arrival drew curious glances, but nobody expected what happened next. A Marine aide stepped out first, opened the rear door, and stood quietly aside. Brigadier General Daniel Whitaker emerged in full dress uniform, adjusting his cover before returning the salutes offered by the Marines closest to the vehicle. He acknowledged each one with practiced respect, never breaking stride as he walked toward the center of the gathering. Staff Sergeant Tyler Brooks immediately came to attention, expecting an inspection or perhaps a brief visit with the families attending Heritage Day. Instead, the general continued past him, past the officers waiting near the hospitality tent, and stopped only when he reached Nathan Mercer. For a brief moment, the two men simply looked at one another. Nathan's expression softened into a familiar smile. "Daniel," he said quietly. The general answered with equal warmth. "Sir, I have been hoping I would meet you again." Then Brigadier General Daniel Whitaker rendered a precise Marine salute, holding it with the respect reserved for someone who had shaped lives rather than headlines. The training field fell completely silent. One by one, Marines standing nearby followed the general's example until an unplanned line of salutes stretched across the edge of the demonstration area. Families stopped talking. Children instinctively lowered the small flags they had been waving. Older veterans slowly removed their caps. Nathan returned the salute with calm dignity before lowering his hand. "You remembered," he said. Whitaker smiled gently. "My father made certain of that. He told me that if I was ever fortunate enough to stand in front of Nathan Mercer, I was to thank him before saying anything else." He extended his hand, and Nathan accepted it with an easy smile. "Your father was always a better student than he admitted." A quiet laugh passed between them, carrying the comfortable familiarity of people connected by decades of shared tradition. Staff Sergeant Tyler Brooks looked from the general to Nathan, still trying to understand how an elderly visitor had earned such unmistakable respect. Frank Delaney stepped beside him and spoke softly enough that only Brooks could hear. Nathan never chased recognition. He trained instructors who later trained thousands of Marines. Most of the balance drills, movement principles, and restraint you learned can be traced through generations of teachers back to men like him. Brooks felt the truth settle heavily inside him. The demonstration had never been about proving who was stronger. It had been a lesson in judgment, humility, and quiet leadership from the very beginning. Brigadier General Whitaker reached into his coat and unfolded a worn photograph protected inside a clear sleeve. It showed a line of young Marines standing beneath the California sun many decades earlier. At the center stood a lean instructor holding the same polished oak cane. Whitaker handed the photograph to Brooks. "That is my father in the second row," he said. "Every success I have enjoyed as a Marine began with lessons passed down from the man standing beside you today. Some legacies are written in records. Others continue walking through the people they quietly shape. Nathan Mercer studied the old photograph for another moment, before carefully handing it back to Brigadier General Daniel Whitaker. His fingers lingered on the worn edges, as though they were greeting old friends rather than faded paper. "Most of those young men believed they would change the Marine Corps," Nathan said, with a quiet smile. "The truth is that the Marine Corps changed all of us." Whitaker nodded. "Because someone taught them what mattered before they ever wore rank." For several peaceful seconds neither man spoke. The afternoon carried on around them with surprising gentleness. A flag snapped overhead. Somewhere across the parade grounds a child laughed while climbing into a restored military truck. Volunteers continued handing out bottled water, careful not to disturb the remarkable stillness that had settled over the gathering. Staff Sergeant Tyler Brooks stepped forward, holding the envelope containing the prize money. His expression no longer carried the easy confidence that had opened the demonstration. It carried humility instead. "Sir," he said, offering the envelope with both hands, "I would be honored if you accepted this." Nathan looked at the envelope before returning his attention to Brooks. "Keep it." Brooks hesitated. "You earned every dollar." Nathan slowly shook his head. "Then let it earn something for someone else." Brooks waited, uncertain what he meant. Nathan glanced toward a group of young Marines, helping families fold chairs after the event. "Use it for a scholarship. Buy books for a Marine's child. Help a military family travel home for the holidays. Money has a way of disappearing. Kindness usually stays where you leave it." Brooks lowered the envelope, feeling a quiet sense of regret for the assumptions he had made only an hour earlier. "Sir," he said sincerely, "I judged you before I listened. I will remember that for the rest of my career." Nathan placed a gentle hand on the younger Marine's shoulder. "Then today was worth both of our time." Brigadier General Whitaker looked across the assembled Marines, before speaking in a calm voice that carried without effort. "What happened here today was never about a public challenge. It was about discovering that experience does not always announce itself. Wisdom rarely asks for attention, and the greatest teachers often leave behind stronger people instead of louder stories." No one applauded. Somehow applause would have made the moment smaller. Veterans quietly replaced their caps. Parents looked at their children with thoughtful expressions. Young Marines stood a little straighter than before, each carrying away a lesson that could not be measured by rank or prize money. Nathan adjusted his faded jacket, thanked the volunteer who had offered him water, and shook Tyler Brooks' hand one final time. "Keep asking people to step forward," he said. "Just remember that the quietest person in the crowd may have already walked farther than any of us can see." With that, he turned toward the parking lot. The polished oak cane met the pavement with its familiar, measured rhythm as he made his way to an old pickup truck, waiting beneath the afternoon sun. He never looked back. He did not need to. Behind him, the demonstration field slowly returned to its ordinary routine. But the people standing there knew they had witnessed something that would stay with them far longer than any contest. Some legacies are remembered because history records them. The finest ones endure because they quietly become part of the character of everyone fortunate enough to learn from them.